All right. Hello and good morning. If you have a handout, you can open with me to the Psalms. And we're not going to cover the Psalms today, but we are going to cover what the Hebrew Bible refers to as the writings. So let me go ahead and open us in a word of prayer, and then we can dive in. Heavenly Father, you are holy and righteous and just, and you are the one who speaks truth and never lies. You are the creator and the sustainer of all things. You are the one that we direct our praise and adoration to. And we do that because that is what you have commanded in your word repeatedly, and that is what we see in your word repeatedly. And so we pray that this time of study of your word would utilize our hearts, our minds, our actions and affections, and Lord, that you would be glorified as we draw near to you through the study of your word and understanding all that you have revealed to us, and then echoing that back to you in praise and adoration. May you use this time as we study the Psalms and other portions of the Old Testament and know what they say about you, and may you be glorified in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so we have been moving along in our study of the Old Testament, and we are going in the order of the Hebrew Old Testament. And I forgot that the other day, so I was doing out the next 3 months plan, and I immediately we did Malachi, and then I'm jumping into the New Testament, and Vincent said, are we going to do the writings? And I said, yes, we will do those. That's a huge portion of the Old Testament, and a very valuable portion of the Old Testament. And really, this portion of the Old Testament is as Christians, we probably tend to turn to some of these books the most. And I think the way that we'll study them today, you'll start to see why these books have resonated with Christians. Going back into our previous studies, the Hebrew Old Testament is divided into three portions. The law, Genesis through Deuteronomy, the prophets, which we have walked through, and that's Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings are known as the former prophets, and then the latter prophets are Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and then the 12 minor prophets, which are a singular book. So we've just finished covering them, and now we enter of the Hebrew Scriptures, and this is what the Hebrew Bible would refer to as the writings, or the Ketuvim. And each of the portions of the Hebrew Old Testament. So we have the Torah, and that's the foundation of wisdom. And then in the prophets, at the beginning of the prophets, you have the book of Joshua. And what is at the beginning of Joshua? It points back to the Torah as the foundation for wisdom and insight and understanding. And what is Joshua to do? He's to, this book of the law you are to meditate on day and night, that you may prosper. And so then Psalm 1 is going to say something very similar. How blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, nor stand in the way of sinners, nor sit in the seat of scoffers, but his delight is in the law of the Lord. Yeah, and in his law he meditates day and night. So each portion of the Hebrew Old Testament is still going to point back to and refer to the Torah, the law, as the foundation of understanding and wisdom. And so, but when we come to the writings, I have them laid out there. There's going to be a few. So I'm counting up, how many books is that? So 3, 8, and then 4 more. So 14. No, I can do math. Me do math. 12. All right. And the writings begin with 3 books, Psalms, Job, and Proverbs, a little bit out of our traditional English Bible order. And then they end with 3 more books, with Daniel and then Ezra, Nehemiah, which as as we look at that, we'll see that will really be one book, just like other Old Testament books. And then Chronicles, which is also one book split into 2. And then in the middle, we have the Megillot, which is a series of 5 small scrolls that were read at different times in the Hebrew calendar, and they're in a particular order, and they're I think there's links between that order, and we'll talk about that as we march through. But you see Song of Songs, Ruth, Ecclesiastes, Lamentations, and Esther was each read at a different festival or a different time of year in the Hebrew calendar, and that was connected with the contents of the book and what it was communicating. So we'll talk about that more as we go through each of those books, but the overall character of the writings and of these books, I think this is where they have resonated so significantly with the church throughout history. The emphasis is really upon the individual godly man or woman. And each of these books begins with the focus on an individual. And some of them you may not have thought through, and you're like, wait, really? So with Psalms, it's that how blessed is the man, the individual. And then Job, obviously it's Job. Proverbs, who would be the focus? How does it begin? 1:1 is the Proverbs of Solomon. And he's going to put forth wisdom. Song of Songs, you have Solomon again. Ruth and Ecclesiastes, you have the preacher. Lamentations is a little bit unique. You have the city of Jerusalem is being personified as a woman. And she has faced her destruction and experienced it. And then Esther, and then Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles. Anyone remember how Chronicles begins? Begins with a list of names, and the first name is Adam, and it's a unique genealogy because it's just names. There's not really any filler words. It's just Adam, Seth, and it goes from there. So each of the books in the writings is going to emphasize and focus in on the individual, and there's going to be some secondary characteristics, and these books are also going to show forth patterns for prayer and praise. And where is that most obvious? Yeah, in the Psalms, right? In the Psalter, and seeing how Old Testament Israel worshipped, and we're slowly starting to sing more and more Psalms here. We're working on that. But that in Colossians 3, the Apostle Paul commands, he says, yeah, sing and teaching and instructing one another with psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. And so there's a rich theology in the Psalms, and we want that to inform what we sing and how we sing and who we sing to. And we see over and over again in these books in particular, the patterns for prayer and for praise. If you just think about in Ezra and Nehemiah, when Nehemiah is called up by the king, what does he immediately do? He offers a quick prayer. What is Daniel unwilling to abandon, even on the threat of being thrown into the lion's den? Prayer, yeah. And so we see the life of faith lived out in a profound way in these books, and it sets a pattern for us to follow. Now, we also see insight into God's work in the world, of how he is working behind the scenes in a variety of ways. We see that in Job, right? Because God is working behind the scenes in Job's life, and he's working in and through the suffering in Job's life. God is the source of wisdom in Proverbs. Psalms is going to be a whole other thing. There's so much revealed in such a rich theology in the Psalms. But then in Ruth and Esther, we see how God is working providentially to save his people in ordinary means, whether to bring about 2 people for marriage or to rescue his people from imminent danger. And then the same thing in Daniel and Ezra and Nehemiah, we just see God's provision and his superintendence over all of the kingdoms of the world. We also see lessons drawn from God's creative order. And this is really, we'll talk more about wisdom, that as God has created the world and everything in it, right, as we saw last week, that he has ordered and set into creation a certain wisdom. And this is just the way certain things work. And this is just the way things are. And wisdom, as we'll see, wisdom is kind of this impersonal force. It's connected with God, but it's different from the traditional way of teaching elsewhere in the scriptures, because wisdom, if you violate wisdom, you yourself are going to bear all of the consequences and the result. Wisdom doesn't necessarily emphasize grace or mercy. It's just if you are wise, you will prosper, and if you're foolish, you alone will suffer the consequences of that. And you can see that in Proverbs 9. And so there's going to be a lot of lessons drawn just from the created order that God has ordained in what he has made. And then we also will see among these secondary characteristics the responses of the godly to God's ways. And again, this goes back into God's work in the world. If God is working in a particular way, how are we to respond? And Daniel is going to really show us of how are we to respond to hostile government, right? How are we to assimilate into the culture? And also, I think there's a contrasting there of the responses of Esther and Mordecai, whose goal is to fit in and to not be seen necessarily as Jews. They still want to be Jews and they want to protect themselves, but they don't take any kind of a stance against the culture where Daniel and his three friends, what do? They do the exact opposite of we are not going to give in to demands. We're going to walk in the way of the Lord and as we have been commanded. So we see different responses of the godly to God's ways and what we are called to do. And then again, models of devotion of God's people, of what does it look like to truly follow God faithfully. And all of those are going to be seen in the characteristics. And again, this is where I think as we read these even as Christians, and where it deeply resonates with us and we're drawn to these books without really understanding the full implications of it. So within the writings, there's certain particular genres that I want to kind of talk through because within the writings, we're going to have narrative in Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, Chronicles, Esther. So there's lots of portions where this is just telling us and weaving a story for us to glean from and begin to apply into our own lives. But there's also going to be lots of poetry. And poetry is actually prominent throughout the entire Old Testament. And Hebrew doesn't really even have a word for poetry or a poem, but they use this form continuously. I think of the 39 books in the Old Testament, only 5 of them don't have any poetry. And so poetry is prominent and predominant even in what we were studying over the past few weeks. As you read in your Bible, in the prophets, what's the layout? Is it written and laid out as if it's a story, or is it laid out like poetry? Right? And so even though they were prophets, they were also poets. They're writing figuratively, and they're using language to rhyme things. And that's really that paragraph that you see under the characteristics of Hebrew poetry. When we write poetry, because you all write poetry, right? It's kind of a lost art where previously in older generations, poetry was regularly read and memorized, and people could expound upon what they had read and were thinking through. And people wrote poetry far more frequently than they do now. And we see that again in Hebrew culture in ancient times. Poetry was a very common thing. And again, David wrote it. The prophets all wrote poetry. Moses laid out his prophecies poetically. And in Hebrew poetry, they rhyme sounds, but it's harder for us to see that as we cross from Hebrew into English. That kind of gets lost. They do rhyme sounds, among other things, but they also focus more upon rhyming ideas. And throwing ideas alongside one another and comparing them and contrasting them, where typically in English language poetry, what do we typically do? What do we like to rhyme? Yeah, the last sound or making things abrupt. I need to brush up on all my poetry forms. But I have a quote there from the ESV Study Bible, which I found really helpful. It says, in that paragraph, this parallel structure, speaking about parallelism and usually consisting of 2 lines, that this parallelism of being able to throw 2 ideas together offers the poet a surprisingly rich framework for artistic development. The poet is not simply saying the same thing twice in slightly different terms. The parallel line structure provided Hebrew poets with a means of exploiting similarity and difference on the levels of sound, syntax. What is syntax? Grammar. So being able to emphasize how many syllables were in something or how something was broken up. In Hebrew, they would have these accent marks where they would show divisions within the thought and the balance of a particular verse, and so they could mark out, hey, I want this verse to be 3 lines, or I just want it to be 2 lines, or I want it to be 4 lines. They would be able to mark and distinguish all of that out, and that's where a faithful Bible translation is going to hopefully mirror the Hebrew breakdowns of that in the English translation. So the syntax and then semantics, which is just the meanings of words. So Hebrew rhymes all of those ideas. The sound, the syntax, and the semantics to achieve an artistically compelling expression of their vision. Unfortunately, of these 3 elements, the first 2, the sound and the syntax, usually do not survive translation. And that's where you should all learn Hebrew. And that's the wrong. I remember my seminary profs of saying like the Word of God is amazing and powerful in the English language, and so I don't want to diminish that in any way. But beginning to learn the original languages, it's like adding color into a black and white movie. Like you begin to see things fully and how the author is using ideas and words and, again, the sounds and the syntax. So there's a lot to be learned, but it's thought-provoking even as we read Hebrew poetry in English. So I don't want to diminish that in any way. And so I have some examples of Hebrew poetry kind of pulled from, usually from the Psalms, but one example within Proverbs, but it's myriad throughout all Hebrew poetry. And so there's different ways of, again, throwing aside these ideas. And again, I've kind of focused in on that parallelism structure there where there's two ideas being thrown together in 2 lines. There's other forms within that, and not necessarily every Hebrew line of poetry is only going to be 2 lines. But that's kind of going into the formal is kind of like the catch-all of it, just expressing information in a format. And you'd probably even cross out the 2-line. But let's work through some of these examples. The synonymous way of kind of throwing things together, that you are expressing the same idea, really using 2 different words and synonyms throughout. And so what you see there is the heavens declare the glory of God, and the skies proclaim the work of his hands. So you see what's the counterpart to the heavens? The skies. And so those are 2 different Hebrew words, and the heavens are used as a word numerous times in the Old Testament, but that word for the skies really is only used in Genesis 1 to speak about what God created. So again, there's an artistry here when you begin to see like, oh, the way these words are being used, and then the connection that is being made between each of them. And then declare is connected with what? Proclaiming, yeah. And so you kind of get that idea of these inanimate parts of creation are speaking and preaching and proclaiming to human beings and to the animals. And what are they declaring or proclaiming? And then the glory of God is being connected with, and there's a line and that connection being made to the works of his hands. And it's like we are living, in one sense, we are living in God's creation, in his glory. And so again, there's a lot to be thought about and meditated upon of like, hey, I get to see and live in the glory of God, even here in this building. That's amazing. And so there's so much contemplation, and usually we speed right past it. And in the ESV Study Bible, if you have one of those at home, that's a wonderful reference. I would encourage you to get that. They talk about this verse in particular and show how in the Hebrew there's even a certain word balance to everything. So again, there's kind of a tipping point. And that's usually what the Hebrew likes to do, is if you think of a seesaw, right? When I go on a seesaw with one of my sons, I have to work harder than they do, because they can't touch the ground yet. And I'm there, and I'm way heavier, and I'm balancing, I'm putting them up and down. But eventually you could move, what is that portion of it's like the fulcrum? Yeah, you could move the fulcrum a different direction, and eventually, no matter how much was on either side, it would be balanced, right, because of the leverage. And that's kind of what the Hebrew does in the text and with those accent marks. They're able to say, here is the halfway point and or the midpoint, and everything on this side is just as heavy as everything on this side. And actually it's powerful to see that in certain portions of Leviticus, because in Leviticus they'll have these long commands, and then at the end of it, it'll say, I am Yahweh. And you're like, okay. And then you look in the Hebrew, and the fulcrum is way over here. And so one half of it is all of the commands, and then on the other half of equal weight is just that little statement, I am the Lord, I am Yahweh. And so again, that adds of like, okay, there's something I need to think about here in terms of the balance of how significant it is of what is being commanded and also who is commanding it. So there's little nuances here. And that comes out in your English Bible. So I would work, or I'd encourage you to start to notice some of those things, or how something is laid out in the text, and what is this meaning and saying. So there's synonymous parallelism, which is expressing the same thing, and then by throwing those ideas together and saying the same thing, the Hebrew poet is really heightening our understanding of overall what is being said, right? But also, there's an antithetical parallelism that's going to express opposing things, opposite ideas. We see this in Proverbs 10:1. A wise son makes a father glad, but a foolish son is a grief to his mother. So let's talk about what's being thrown alongside. What's the opposite? A wise son and a foolish, right? So there's the contrast. If you can go, and this is so often in Proverbs, you can do this or you can do that, and here's going to be the outcome. And it's expressing a relationship between a son and his parents. Yeah, and that's the idea. So if he is a wise son, is his mother still going to be unhappy with him? Or is it, again, it's just a Hebrew way of throwing these things alongside. And so you're not going to say the same thing twice, but it's going to say a wise son makes a father glad, and then his mother a grief if he's foolish. But his father is still going to be, he's still going to be a grief to his father. It's the idea of, hey, the parents are being connected there. And then what's the verb that's being thrown alongside and contrasted? Yeah, well, it's the making glad, and then it is a grief, right? And so what is it? What's the effect? Is you're either going to be a grief to your parents, or you're going to be a joy. You're going to bring them joy or sadness within that, based upon how you conduct yourself. If you conduct yourself wisely or foolishly, and again, that brings together lots of ideas, and there's lots of places to be able to pull it apart and talk through. And it's wonderful for discipleship and conversation at the dinner table as you walk through this. And again, poetry lends itself to that, being able to, as I talked about last week, right, of taking that diamond. How's a jeweler look at that diamond? Right, they take it out, they put their little eyeglass on, and they're turning it and twisting it, and that's what poetry is worthy of, more and more thought and examination and meditation. So then there's also a synthetical parallelism, and that's the idea of it's expressing thoughts that are going to compound. They're going to build upon one another. And in one sense, the synonymous and antithetical are building upon one another in the comparing or contrasting, but here it's kind of a logical compounding and a connection between one action and then another. And that's what we see here in Psalm 3, verse 4. To the Lord, or to Yahweh, I cry aloud, and he answers me from his holy mountain. So what do we learn here? What's the psalmist seeking to communicate? In one sense, he's just expressing what happened, right? And again, going back to this is a model for devotion and adoration and praise and prayer, right? He cried aloud, and then what did God do? Yeah, he answered. He responded. And again, the connection that is intended to be seen here is even just think, and where does God cry out or answer from? Yeah, so what's the picture is, where's David, where's the psalmist? Down here, and God is up here, and David cries out. And usually it's like if you were to go to the bottom of Bogus Basin and shout up at somebody to the top, even just on the ski hill, let alone like at the bottom of Bogus Basin Road, are they going to hear you? No, not at all. You could be shouting all day and they're not going to hear a word. But what the psalmist is saying, I shout and God hears, even though he is far away and greater and distant and on his holy mountain, he is still able to hear and respond to me as I cry out to him. So again, building and compounding thoughts there. And then emblematic. And this is going to be expressing similar qualities. And so you're familiar with this verse, as the deer pants for the water brooks, so my soul pants for you, O God. And again, so what is it that's being thrown alongside the deer and my own soul? Yeah. And so this is what is being, and as the deer, and again, you see the same exact verb that's being used there. So what's different? The verb is the same, but there's different subjects, yeah. And then there's different objects. And again, so this is the idea of it's making a connection of, so the deer pants for water because he's thirsty and in need, and he's not going to survive without that water. In the same way, my soul pants for and longs to have God. And if I don't get God, I'm going to die. That's the idea and the emphasis. So just to begin to think through. And then there's kind of just a formal expressing information. Sometimes this is in a 2-line, sometimes it's in multiple 2-6. But as for me, I have installed my king upon Zion, my holy hill. And it's going to just be building upon information of God the Father is the speaker. And what has he done? He's installed a king. He's installed the Son to be king over the nations, and again, upon Zion, my holy mountain. And again, you see the idea of the holy mountain recurring within that. So sometimes it's just straightforward, not necessarily building upon one another, but you have just formal statements. And that's going to be easy to see because within that formal statement, there's not really anything building upon from one line to the next, right? There's no comparison, there's no contrasting, there's no symbolic or emblematic throwing alongside, and there's no compounding thought. It's just, hey, I've established my king and upon Zion. So any questions kind of on the... Yeah, it's going to clarify. I guess there's not that immediate response within that, but I can get more information to you on that from some of this is from what we talked through in our Old Testament class, and that one wasn't as clear to me. I'm like, I need to go back for that, but I would say like within you have in the synthetical where it's compounding, you have that comparison of the and then the crying aloud and answering is kind of a call and response, but upon there's not really any there's not even a verb in the second line of Psalm 2 verse 6. So it's just kind of but as for me, I've installed my king, and then it's clarifying the domain of it, and it really could kind of just continue on within that. Does that make sense? That would be my guesstimate. And there's no conjunction, yeah. So, good question. I should have known the answer. All right, if we turn over to the characteristics of the wisdom literature. Okay, so poetry, and poetry is going to be, again, prevalent not just in the writings, but throughout the entire Old Testament. But then there's another subset of the writings known as the wisdom literature. And if you look just below the definition, we'll get back to that, but the wisdom books are typically identified as Job, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes. And those are the ones you probably could have guessed. But then there's also certain psalms that are wisdom psalms, and clearly identified. And there's others that have certain calls to wisdom within them. I would also say, you can probably write in Psalm 90 by Moses is also, I would say, a wisdom psalm. As I look at that right now, I'm like, oh, that needs to be there. And so thinking through these particular books are going to have, and chapters are going to have some common ground within this. And this is going to be describing and discussing the concept of wisdom. But what is wisdom? It is the skill of being able to form and execute the correct plan to gain the desired results. And so thinking through wisdom is, what are all of my options? What do I even want to pursue? What's the best pursuit for me? What am I seeking to achieve? And then what's the best path to get there? As we think about and discuss the homeschool co-op right now, we have a meeting after church today. What's hard is that there's so many different ways to do something, right? Those are the most difficult decisions. Like, I could do this like one of 15 different ways, and which way is the best way? Well, sometimes, how do you usually find out what's the best way? Yeah, you try one, and then you're like, that wasn't it. Okay, let me try this one over here. Nope, that one wasn't it either. And so we learn wisdom sometimes as we go by trial and error. That's not the best way to learn wisdom, but it is a way of learning wisdom. And so wisdom is going to be able to look at a situation and understand what is it that needs to be done. And this Hebrew word, chokmah, is used repeatedly in the Old Testament, describing a specific like skill or a trade. Like the men who made the tabernacle in Exodus, they had wisdom for how to make things, and then also there's a wisdom in how to lead administratively, especially in a human government. So Joseph had wisdom to lead Egypt out of or in the time of a famine. Daniel had wisdom to be able to lead. Daniel was probably one of the most learned men in the Old Testament, of what he was able to, the education that he received, and then his ability to lead and to execute. There was a reason that he was basically one of the three leaders within the Babylonian Empire. So the word is often used in that way. But then that second portion there is, again, another quote from the ESV Study Bible. It says that, in essence, wisdom is the skill in the art of godly living, or more fully, it is that orientation which allows one to live in harmonious accord with God's ordering of the world. Remember, we talked about that the writings are going to just lay out, like, this is the way God made things. It just is. And you can either align yourself with that and you will receive the blessings and benefits of it. But if you try to go contrary to it, you're going to be steamrolled. And that's going to be the key understanding of sometimes wisdom. It's either if you reject wisdom, you're going to receive and bear the consequences. And that's going to be seen over and over again. If we can look at this, go to Proverbs 9. And as we'll see in future weeks, the Proverbs actually begin in chapter 10, verse 1. And the first 9 chapters are Solomon making an appeal to his son, repeatedly saying over and over again, you need to be ready for wisdom. And chapter 9, the last portion of making his appeal to his son, he's going to lay out 2 paths. Like, you can listen to wisdom, Lady Wisdom, and she's kind of personified throughout the first 9 chapters, or you can listen to the woman of folly. And so chapter 9, verse 1, we see Lady Wisdom. She's built her house, and she has hewn out her 7 pillars. And then in verse 13 of chapter 9, the woman of foolishness is boisterous, a woman of simplicity, and does not know anything. And so these 2 women are there, and if you read those each of them have 6 verses, so 1 through 6, and then 13 through 18. So 18 verses, and it's divided into 3 sections. And the first and the third section are comparing and contrasting Lady Wisdom and the woman of folly, and they're both making similar appeals. They're both calling to everybody who's passing by, saying, hey, come, listen to me, and they're making promises of certain things. And then in the middle of that, so you have that parallelism on a bigger scale, in opposition or antithetical parallelism in a bigger scale within the chapter. And then in the middle portion, if you look at verse 7, he who disciplines a scoffer receives disgrace for himself, and he who reproves a wicked man receives injury for himself. And you're like, yeah, I tried to do that on social media, and it didn't work out well. But that's sometimes, if someone is a fool or a scoffer, do they want to be told that they're acting foolishly? Yeah, you're going to get rebuffed and ignored and attacked. And then it says, verse 8, do not reprove a scoffer, lest he hate you. Reprove a wise man, and he will love you. Give knowledge to a wise man, and he will be still wiser. And make a righteous man know it, and he will increase his learning. So a scoffer, what do? They don't want to learn. But a wise man, he will say, give me more. Yeah, give me more instruction. I want to hear and know more. I want to continue to grow. Verse 10, the fear of Yahweh is the beginning of wisdom. Right, and we'll come back around to that. And the knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. For by me your days will become many, and your years of life will be added to you. If you are wise for yourself. And if you scoff, you alone will bear it. And again, that's kind of the nature of wisdom, where it's like, there's not an emphasis upon grace of like, hey, you can mess up and God will use that for good. It's like, if you mess up, this is going to hurt you. That's kind of the emphasis of the Proverbs and of wisdom in general. Like, again, if you go against God's created order and what he has done, you're going to bear the consequences and the difficulties of that. And that's seen over and over again. And so Proverbs is one. Proverbial sayings, that's what we typically think about. There's going to be also moral exhortations along the way. I would even say Psalm 2 might be categorized as a wisdom psalm, and at the end of the Psalm 2 there's going to be a moral exhortation. Kiss the Son, and so pay homage to him. Humble yourself before the King that God has established, and that's the beginning point of understanding the Psalms. That's definitely a moral exhortation. And then we're also going to have, with Job and Ecclesiastes, we have extended wisdom discourse. So they're written very differently than the Proverbs. And in Ecclesiastes and in Job, there are no commands. There's no commands to the reader, but there is a ton of wisdom, and it's a kind of wisdom that we have to kind of go along and pick up, and it's more difficult. We have to work to get wisdom from Job and Ecclesiastes. It's a lot more difficult, but it's there, and it's lying around, but it's like, oh, yeah, there's something over here, and then, oh, I've never thought about that. Let me get that a little bit of wisdom, and then over here. So that's what we see over and over again in Job and Ecclesiastes. But it's a different kind of discourse and a different type of subgenre of wisdom, and especially Job. Like, Job is an amazing book where you're like, oh, I thought I understood it, and then you're like, there's far more here than I realized, and so. Then there's also wisdom poetry, and that's really in the Psalms and Job 28, the heart of Job, and then Proverbs 8, that there's going to be these poetic descriptions and talking through what wisdom is like and how to receive it and benefit from it. So ultimately, the wisdom in the writings and in the wisdom literature, it comes directly from God. Proverbs 8, beginning in verse 22, says, Yahweh possessed me at the beginning of his way, before his deeds of old. From everlasting I was installed, from the beginning, from the earliest times of the earth. When there were no depths, I was brought forth, and when there were no springs heavy with water. Before the mountains were settled, before the hills I was brought forth. So again, if you have, and there's some in church history who have said this is speaking about Christ. And I wouldn't necessarily say this is speaking about Christ. I think this is more God's wisdom that he implanted in the created order. And again, that's what we've been talking about. Like God has created his universe with an inherent wisdom attached to it, because there's just certain laws of how things work and how they don't work. And so ultimately we see that wisdom is going to come from God. It is divine. Wisdom is the source of life. Proverbs 3:18. We can turn over there since we're there close by. That she is a tree of life to those who seize her, and all those who hold her fast are blessed. And then wisdom is also going to be moral. It's going to be determining what is right and what is wrong, what is foolish and what is wise. All the words of my mouth are in righteousness, and there is nothing twisted or crooked in them. They are all straightforward to him who understands, and right to those who find knowledge. And then again, as we said, kind of from Proverbs 9, is that wisdom is available to everybody. Wisdom and foolishness are both calling out to every single person, and every single person has to make a decision. Which one am I going to listen to? And that same call is made by the lady wisdom in chapter 1 of Proverbs. And she's crying out in the streets, come, and she's beckoning them in. And then when they scoff and reject, they will bear their punishment. And so we see this within the wisdom literature, that this is God's plan for life. It's available to everybody. It's moral. It's the source of life, and it's rooted and flows out from God himself. So let's look at these characteristics of the wisdom literature. So again, they address the individual, and this is by contrast, rather than dealing with the nation as a whole, and they're seeking and focusing in on an individual. How did they respond? How should they have responded? What was their success? What was their failures? And then the wisdom literatures are especially directed to the youth. Right? Proverbs is primarily a book from a father to a son. And Proverbs 31, what is that about, ladies? Yeah, usually we say, well, it's the excellent woman, but yeah, it's actually a mama telling her boy, this is what you look for in a wife. Now, that's a mom discipling her son, where the rest of Proverbs is really a dad discipling his son, with some other Proverbs in there at the end after chapter 25. And so it's addressing the individual, and then the authority is moral experience and trained intelligence. It's seeking to gain wisdom. And again, comparing and contrasting Job and Ecclesiastes with this. And even on Friday night at the counseling conference, I talked about parenting. Of our goal is we want to bring our kids from immaturity to maturity. And that is kind of within our scope of things as we disciple and pour into them. They're not really going to be truly wise unless they fear Yahweh. That's the beginning of wisdom. But there's also a certain realm of we are able to teach our kids. There are unbelievers who are mature and act in wisdom without fully understanding everything, right? There's unbelievers who can show up to work on time and know to work diligently, and they know and understand that if they labor faithfully and save, that they'll have money for later on. So there's principles within the wisdom literature that even unbelievers can follow, and to the degree that they follow them, even detached from God, what will be the outcome? Because God has ordained and put this wisdom in the world. If they follow the wisdom even without understanding it, they will benefit from it. Not that is with God's full desire for them. They still need to look to him in faith and repentance. But the authority within the wisdom literature is going to be moral experience and trained intelligence. So this is what is going to lead to blessing within that. And then the concern is really the workaday world or everyday life, right? Even just practical things, right? Like, don't greet your neighbor with a loud voice early in the morning, right? Like it's like, why is that in there? Because that's an easy way to start a conflict, right? And so there's just practical living, and even in these small areas where, like, Solomon included that to disciple his son. And the method is counsel and patient instruction. And so we've talked in the past of where the priests were to teach Israel the law, and the prophets would preach and indict Israel for the failing to use the law. And the counselor, and kind of way Proverbs, rather than being head on like this, Proverbs is kind of like coming alongside and putting his arm around the person he's talking to and saying, hey, if you do this, if you follow Lady Wisdom, this is what's going to be the outcome. But if you follow the woman of folly, she leads to death. Don't do that. Like, this is kind of how, kind of the difference. But all of them are the same instruction, right? Proverbs says that, don't listen to the woman of folly. Leviticus is saying, and Exodus and Deuteronomy are saying, don't commit adultery. Right? Thou shalt not. And so Proverbs is going about the same exhortations in a different capacity and in a different way, but they're still just as authoritative and important. So the method is counsel, and when I say patient instruction, you can read Proverbs and you'll say, like, certain topics come up repeatedly. Why is that? Yeah, we're slow to learn. And what's the key to learning? Repetition, right? I need to hear this over and over again. And I need to see this in different ways and to hear it repeatedly. And sometimes you're like, that's the exact same proverb that I read like 3 chapters ago.
There's also some different aspects, highlight all the money proverbs, right?
Oh, yeah. And that's where, and we'll talk about this later on in Proverbs, each proverb is not exhaustive. It's just you have the wisdom, then you'll be able to better apply it, which is the next portion. If you turn over to Proverbs chapter 2, where Solomon is going to outline to his son that wisdom is going to be hard to obtain. It's the most valuable thing that you can get, but it doesn't necessarily come easy. So Proverbs 2, beginning of verse 1, my son, if you will receive my words and treasure my commandments within you, to make your ear pay attention to wisdom, incline your heart to discernment. For if you call out for understanding, give your voice for discernment. If you seek her as silver and search for her as for hidden treasures, then you will understand the fear of Yahweh and find the knowledge of God. And then the very next statement says, what? Who is it that gives wisdom? For Yahweh gives wisdom. From his mouth come knowledge and discernment. So again, it goes back to what we said before. Wisdom is going to come from God. Even though it comes from God, what am I to do? I'm to seek it and to cry out for it and to pursue it like I'm looking for buried treasure and for silver. And so wisdom is the priceless thing that we should be pursuing. And again, but wisdom is connected and inseparable from God. The beginning of wisdom is the fear of Yahweh. And so I need to be pursuing that continually. But then also Job is actually going to build upon this picture. Job 28 is a psalm, and it's at the very middle portion. It's kind of a divider within the book. Job 28 is really going to say you can mine and search all you want for a certain kind of wisdom, and you're never going to find it because it is beyond you. And that is concerning the way that God deals with evil and uses evil. And that's the emphasis of Job 28 of you, and all the same kind of mining imagery. You can search and look and find it, but you're not going to locate it because it is altogether beyond you. And if we turn to Job 28. At the beginning of the chapter, surely there is a mine for silver and a place where they refine for gold, and iron is taken from the dust and copper is smelted from rock, and man puts an end to darkness, and to the farthest limit he searches out the rock in thick darkness and the shadow of death, and he sinks the shaft far from habitation, forgotten by the foot, and they hang and swing to and fro far from men. So he talks about men digging down and mining and searching for all of these things, but ultimately not being able to find what they are searching for. And it goes down, if you jump down to verse 23, speaking about this unique kind of wisdom, God understands its way and he knows its place. For he looks to the set a limit for the rain and a course for the thunderbolt. Then he saw it and recounted it, and he established it and also searched it out. He said to man, behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to turn away from evil is understanding. So there's a lot that you can attain to and find out, but ultimately, Job is presenting a different kind of wisdom that's greater and beyond men. It's a kind of wisdom where it is wise to actually say, this is beyond me, and I need to entrust myself to God when it comes to suffering in this life. And that's the problem of evil is best addressed in the book of Job. And again, that's where slowly studying it more and more will bring forth more and more wisdom concerning suffering in this life. And so wisdom is hard to obtain, but it is also priceless and what we should be pursuing all our lives. And yet there's a certain kind of wisdom that is above and beyond us. And that second to last bullet point there, that wisdom also has a snowballing effect. Okay, and again, as we read in Proverbs 9, if you rebuke a scoffer, what do? I don't want that. I don't need that. But if you instruct and rebuke a wise man, he will become wiser. Yeah, he receives that instruction, and he receives that instruction that also says, give me more. Like, I want more. And so wisdom has this snowballing effect where the more you understand, the more you will understand. And the more you will desire more and more wisdom. And again, as I said, as you grow in wisdom, suddenly with all of the Proverbs and all of with Job and Ecclesiastes, now you're also, because you've grown in wisdom, now you know how to apply wisdom more faithfully in every given situation. So part of wisdom is knowing which proverb do I pick up at this moment in time. What is it that I need to apply? And having the wisdom amplifies my application of wisdom. And so it's going to have this snowballing effect. And it's going to grow more and more as time goes on. And then, how do you begin to have wisdom? Right? Probably familiar with Proverbs 1:7, again, kind of the introduction to the whole book. Yeah. It's the fear of Yahweh. And that's actually where I've really appreciated reading through the Proverbs in the LSB and just seeing the name of God and just throughout. You're just like, man, yeah, this is what Yahweh is Proverbs 3:5. Yeah, trust in the Lord, but yeah, trusting in Yahweh, and even just seeing the flow there of these immediate commands. Trust in Yahweh in verse 5. In verse 6, in all your ways acknowledge him. Verse 7, do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear Yahweh and turn away from evil. Verse 9, honor Yahweh. So there's just this pattern of immediate connections and short commands in relationship to Yahweh, in relationship to the Lord. But the beginning of wisdom is to fear God. And what does that look like? That's worthy of a whole discussion, and we'll leave it more for Proverbs. But so two little quotes here. One from Charles Bridges. I think he was a 19th century pastor in England. He says, what is this fear of the Lord? He says, it is the affectionate reverence by which the child of God bends himself humbly and carefully to his Father's law. Right? The fear of the Lord is humbling yourself and recognizing. Fear is you seeing lights in your rearview mirror and sirens, flashing lights in your rearview mirror, right? You immediately see the lights, and what does your heart do? Hypothetically speaking, for those of you who have been pulled over, but what would happen? What your heart does, yeah, it's like boom, boom. And then, so there's a fear there, but what do you still do? Hopefully, you pull over. And that fear, and in pulling over, what are you acknowledging? You're acknowledging that police officer's authority, and so there's a fear, but there's also that respect to acknowledge their authority over you at this moment in time. And so, to one sense, the fear of Yahweh is like that. You're acknowledging God's authority over your life, and then you're going to humble yourself and respond to that authority rightly. Then that one last quote from Randy Smith, that fearing God is reverence for him that leads to delightful obedience. resulting in peace, joy, and security. And again, those are the outcomes of living life wisely, right? And Ecclesiastes is going to kind of do that of looking backwards of, hey, here's all the things I pursued and they didn't satisfy. And so here's, at the end of it all in Ecclesiastes, what are we to do? Yeah, fear God. I'm sensing a pattern here. Fear God and keep his commandments. This is the pattern of wisdom and what we are called to do. So that's kind of a lengthy introduction to the writings and poetry and wisdom literature. And again, there's a lot more to the writings within that, and we'll walk through it as we move forward. But these books, I think, are going to be a tremendous encouragement to us. Any thoughts, clarifications, questions on any of that? Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Focus. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, not at all. And again, of David's emphasis at the beginning of the Psalms is you need to know who the king is. And then Solomon's emphasis at the beginning of Proverbs is you need to fear Yahweh. And as you're saying, and as I was hinting, like there's a certain realm of parenting where you're just trying to instill maturity. And again, you can do that with your kids regardless, and you should do that because you can't regenerate their heart. But then also that emphasis of if you only do the moral portions or the wisdom portions of Proverbs, you in essence just make your kids better Pharisees. And you teach others to become better Pharisees because then they think that they're doing well. Everything is going well because they're applying wisdom disconnected from the one wisdom comes from. And then they're attributing the outcome of that to themselves rather than in the fear of the Lord, you understand as you apply wisdom, this is not from me, this is from God. And so, yeah, all of that, that's a wonderful, wonderful point where I should move that to the top of this. You got to fear the Lord. And if you don't, it's going to end up, it sets you on a trajectory. And it's going to end up hardening your heart. And that's even with the Pharisees in Jesus' own time. Like they knew and understood the law, and they probably understood little bits and pieces of Psalms and Proverbs, but they were not willing to receive it. They were the scoffers, and they didn't have wisdom as they should have.
The Hebrews passage that we talked about. 13,
Yeah.
lives of your parents, or maybe
Yep.
right?
Oh yeah.
God, whether they want it,
Yeah. 100%. Yeah, we're talking about Hebrews 6 because people always have questions about that. Like, in what sense are those people who have partaken of the Spirit? And yeah, they've been a part of the church and seen all of the blessings that come from following after God. And again, that's where so many kids grow up in the church and then they don't realize how many blessings they receive as a part of that. I love Cotton Mather, who's one of the American Puritans, in talking about that phenomena. He talked about faithfulness begat prosperity, and the daughter killed the mother. Because they didn't understand, like, hey, all of this prosperity that they had, they thought they just earned it, but it was actually because they were being faithful to God and to His Word. And then, again, there's a cycle among generations of how that works. But anyways, we'll pause there, and I'll leave you to continue to contemplate, and we'll look through the writings in the weeks to come. But let's pause in prayer. Father, we thank you so much for the wisdom of your Word, and that you have given it for us to mine and to search out. And Lord, may we be archaeologists of your word, striving to dig deep into it and to bring out all that we can, the treasures that are hidden within it and are ultimately the treasures of Christ, because he is the source of all wisdom and knowledge. And we pray that as we study the writings and the wisdom literature, that ultimately we would come to know and fear him more and to love him more and to submit our lives in obedience to him so that he may be glorified. And the world might see and understand that they don't just need to live wisely, they need to live in reverential fear of the one who lived and died for them. And it is in his name that we pray.